Three Broomsticks wore its Halloween finest, like an elderly witch donning her best robes for a special occasion. Harry paused at the threshold, one hand on the brass handle, warmed by countless palms before his, and breathed in the particular magic of the evening. Wood smoke mingled with cinnamon, nutmeg, and that indefinable scent of old stone buildings holding centuries of conversation within their walls. "Are you going in, or are we meant to admire the door all night?" Ron asked from behind him, though his tone carried more amusement than impatience. Harry pushed the door open and warmth spilled out like liquid welcome. The pub's interior glowed with what must have been 100 floating candles, their flames protected by some clever charm that kept them from dripping wax onto the patrons below. Carved pumpkins sat on every windowsill, their flickering faces ranging from comically cross-eyed to surprisingly artistic renderings of famous witches and wizards. Someone had enchanted autumn leaves to drift lazily down from the ceiling, disappearing just before they reached the tables in gentle sparkles of gold and copper. "Now that's proper Halloween decoration," Ron said, appreciatively, craning his neck to watch a particularly large oak leaf dissolve into motes of amber light. "Mum always goes overboard with the spider webs. These are much nicer." Hermione squeezed past them both, her bushy hair catching the candlelight and turning it bronze. "If you two are quite finished blocking the entrance, there are people trying to get in behind us." Indeed, a small queue had formed, villagers wrapped in traveling cloaks shaking off the October chill with appreciative shivers as they stepped into the pub's embrace. Harry recognized the witch from Scrivenshaft's quill shop, her silver hair pinned up with what looked like actual quills, and the proprietor of the Hogsheade, though what Aberforth Dumbledore was doing at his brother's favorite establishment, Harry couldn't guess. Potter, Weasley, Granger. Madame Rosmerta's voice carried over the pleasant din of conversation and clinking glasses. She emerged from behind the bar with the grace of someone who had been navigating crowded pubs for decades, carrying 3 mugs of butterbeer with practiced ease. "Right on time. I've saved you a spot near the fire. You'll want to hear everything properly from there." She gestured with her chin toward a corner table that somehow sat in the perfect position, close enough to the enormous fireplace to feel its warmth without being roasted, near enough to the bar to catch Rosmerta's attention for refills, and positioned to see the entire pub without being on obvious display. Harry had learned enough about magical spaces to recognize intentional charm work when he saw it. That table had probably been preparing itself for occupants all day. "Hear what?" Ron asked, though he was already following Rosmerta through the crowd with the single-minded determination of someone who had spotted butterbeer. "The stories, dear. It's Halloween, the proper time for ghost tales and old histories." Rosmerta set their mugs down with a flourish, foam threatening to spill over the rims but never quite managing it. "We've been doing this for as long as anyone can remember. Longer, if you believe some of the tales themselves." Harry slid into a chair worn smooth by generations of use. The wood felt alive under his hands, polished by time and touch until it seemed to hum with a gentle warmth all its own. Hermione settled beside him, already scanning the pub with that particular expression she got when encountering something new that demanded cataloguing and understanding. I've read about storytelling traditions in wizarding communities, she said, wrapping her hands around her mug. There's supposed to be something about Halloween specifically, the thinning of barriers between past and present, making it easier for old stories to be heard properly. That's the idea, love, said an elderly wizard at the neighboring table. His beard was so long it tucked into his belt, and his eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief, or might have been candlelight. Though some would say it's not just about hearing, it's about remembering, keeping the threads connected, if you follow me. Before Hermione could ask for clarification, and Harry could see the question forming on her lips, the pub's ambient noise began to shift. Conversations didn't stop so much as soften, the way a common room settles when someone starts telling a proper story. The floating candles dimmed slightly, and the fire in the hearth flared brighter, casting dancing shadows across the assembled faces. Madame Rosmerta had moved to a position near the center of the room, though Harry hadn't seen her walk there. She simply seemed to have arrived, the way important people do in important moments. "Welcome all," she said, and her voice carried without strain to every corner of the pub. "Another Halloween, another gathering. Some of you have been coming since before I took over this place. Some of you," her eyes found Harry's, warm and knowing, "are newer to the tradition. But old or new, you're all welcome at this table tonight." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Someone near the bar called out, "Get on with it, Rosmerta. My butterbeer's getting cold." "Butterbeer doesn't get cold, Horace. It's charmed," Rosmerta replied, without missing a beat. "But very well. We'll begin as we always begin, with Hogsmeade itself." She gestured to an ancient witch in the corner, so small and wizened she might have been carved from an old apple. The witch rose with surprising spryness, accepting an offered arm from a younger wizard, who might have been her grandson or her great-grandson, or possibly someone else's great-grandson entirely. Time did strange things to family resemblances in the wizarding world. "I'll tell you about the founding," the old witch said, her voice like wind through dead leaves, papery but surprisingly strong. Not the official version, mind, the true one. Harry leaned forward despite himself. He had read about Hogsmeade's founding, the only all-wizarding village in Britain, established in some distant medieval time by a wizard named Hengist of Woodcroft. But there was something in the old witch's tone that suggested the official version left out the interesting bits. "Hengist didn't come here because he liked the scenery," she began. "Though it is lovely scenery, to be fair. He came because he was running, fleeing, more like. The muggles in his village had started asking uncomfortable questions about why his garden grew in the middle of winter and why sickness seemed to pass his door by. The fire crackled agreement, sending up a spray of sparks that formed, just for a moment, into the shape of a running man. He brought his family, wife, 3 children, his elderly mother who taught him everything he knew about magic. They walked for weeks, looking for a place where they might live without hiding, and they found this valley tucked away between the mountains, close enough to feel Hogwarts' protective magic, but far enough to not intrude on the school's grounds. Harry glanced toward the darkened windows. Hogwarts was up there, beyond the village, its lights probably visible if he went outside to look. He had walked between school and village so many times, the path was etched in his memory. Every turn, every landmark, every point where the castle came into view like a promise of home. But it wasn't empty, was it? Prompted someone from the crowd. This was clearly a familiar tale, with familiar rhythms. No, it wasn't empty, the old witch agreed. There were others. Other families who'd fled, other magical folk looking for a place to simply exist. They'd been living rough, caves in the mountains, crude shelters in the forest. Hengist found them, and you know what he did? Build them homes, said a young voice. Harry turned to see a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, sitting on her father's lap with wide eyes. Built them homes, the witch confirmed. Used magic openly, joyfully, for the first time in years. Raised cottages from the stone and soil, encouraged the others to do the same. And slowly, carefully, they built a village. Our village. She paused, taking a sip from a cup someone had pressed into her hands. The pub was absolutely silent, except for the fire's gentle conversation with itself. But here's the part they don't put in the history books, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried perfectly. Hengist knew they'd need protection, not just from muggles, but from the loneliness of hiding, from the fear that they'd always be running. So he worked a charm into the very foundations of Hogsmeade, a charm of belonging. Hermione's hand had crept toward her beaded bag, where Harry knew she kept notebooks, and probably 3 different books on magical architecture. But she didn't pull them out. Even Hermione knew this wasn't the time for note-taking. Every stone placed with intention, every door hung with welcome, every hearth blessed with warmth for strangers. The magic's still here, if you know how to feel it. It's why this place has always been a refuge, why even in the darkest times. And here her eyes grew distant, remembering wars Harry had only read about, and one he'd lived through. Hogsmeade has remained, because Hengist built it not just with magic, but with the understanding that we all need a place to come home to. The old witch sat down to appreciative murmurs and raised glasses. Harry found himself touching his own mug, feeling its warmth, wondering if he was imagining a deeper warmth beneath it, something in the table, the chair, the floor itself, something that said, "You belong here." "That's lovely," Hermione said softly, the magic of intentional architecture combined with emotional resonance. "I wonder if there are any papers on 'Here's a tale from my youth,'" interrupted a wizard with a magnificent mustache that appeared to have been cultivated specifically for storytelling purposes. "When I was a boy working at Zonko's, yes, I'm that old, thank you for noticing, we had a haunting." Ron perked up immediately. A proper ghost, a proper pain in the arse. More like the wizard said cheerfully, kept rearranging the inventory. We'd put the Hicko sweets on the top shelf, and next morning they'd be mixed in with the dung bombs. Nearly caused several disasters, I can tell you. The story unfolded with practiced ease. A ghost who turned out to be a previous shopkeeper, dead for 50 years, but still convinced it was his job to organize the merchandise. The resolution involved a respectful conversation, a promise to keep his organizational system, and the ghost finally agreeing to move on with the satisfaction of knowing his life's work was appreciated. More stories followed. A witch told about the time the Shrieking Shack's sounds had changed pitch for a week, creating what she swore was a musical scale. A wizard recounted finding a 200-year-old love letter stuffed behind a loose stone in his shop, and the months he'd spent tracking down descendants to return it. Each tale was met with laughter or appreciative sighs, with questions, and with memories sparked by memories. Harry found himself relaxing in a way he rarely managed. This wasn't the alertness of aura training or the vigilance of someone who'd spent too much of his youth being hunted. This was simply listening, being present, feeling the gentle pull of stories well told. "You're smiling," Ron observed, reaching for what might have been his third butterbeer, or possibly his fourth. Harry had lost count. "Yeah," Harry said. "I suppose I am. It's nice, isn't it?" Hermione said. She had, Harry noticed, finally given up on the idea of taking notes and was simply listening with the same contentment he felt. Being somewhere where magic is just normal, comfortable, where the biggest concern is a ghost reorganizing shop inventory. But even as she said it, Harry felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Not dangerously. Nothing like the cold dread of dementors or the sick anticipation of dark magic. This was subtler, like a melody changing keys. The stories had been light, amusing, the kind shared over drinks between friends. Now, as an elderly wizard with a walking stick carved from what looked like a gnarled wand rose to speak, the quality of attention changed. "I've a tale from further back," the wizard said, "from a Halloween some 40 years past, when things were different at Hogwarts, when the castle held secrets that are only now beginning to be understood." Harry's hand tightened on his mug. 40 years ago would be the early 1950s, well after Tom Riddle's time as a student, but still within living memory. The wizard's eyes found his across the room, and there was something knowing in that gaze. "But that's a story for deeper in the evening," the wizard said, settling back down, "when the fires burned lower and the nights grown thicker. Some tales need the proper darkness to be told right." The mood lightened again as another storyteller stood, but Harry remained aware of that unfinished thread. Something was being saved for later, something that connected to him, to Hogwarts, to the history that always seemed to find him no matter how much he wished for a simple evening of butterbeer and ghost stories. Ron, predictably, had noticed nothing amiss and was debating with a nearby patron about whether Hicko sweets or Belch powder made better pranks. Hermione was watching Harry with that expression that meant she'd noticed something, but was waiting to see if he wanted to talk about it. Madame Rosmerta appeared at their table as if summoned by their thoughts, which perhaps she had been. "More butterbeer?" "Please," all three said in unison, then laughed at the synchronization. As Rosmerta poured from a pitcher that never seemed to empty, she said casually, "You know, it's a good thing you three came tonight. The stories have been waiting for you." "Waiting for us?" Harry asked. But Rosmerta just smiled, mysterious and knowing, and moved away to tend to other tables. Around them, the evening continued its gentle progression, stories flowing like the butterbeer, laughter rising and falling like the enchanted autumn leaves, the fire burning steady and warm. Outside, Halloween night deepened over Hogsmeade, and up on the hill, Hogwarts kept its own watch over the village it had sheltered for centuries. Harry settled back in his chair, Ron's cheerful argument about prank products on one side, Hermione's quiet presence on the other, and let the evening embrace him. Whatever tale was waiting in the deeper darkness could wait a little longer. For now, there was this: warmth, friendship, belonging, and the simple magic of stories shared on Halloween night. The fire crackled, sending up sparks that might have formed shapes if you watched them just right. And if those shapes looked like the running man from the first story, or a lighthouse, or a stag, well, that was the nature of fire on Halloween, wasn't it? Showing you what you needed to see, even if you didn't yet know you needed to see it. The evening had settled into its rhythm like a well-loved song finding its groove. Harry watched the enchanted autumn leaves spiral down from the ceiling, each one tracing a slightly different path through the candlelight before vanishing in those gentle bursts of gold and copper. There was a hypnotic quality to their descent, a patience that seemed to say the night had all the time it needed. Ron had returned from the bar with not just butterbeer, but a plate of something that looked suspiciously like treacle tart, though how he'd convinced Rosmerta to part with it was anyone's guess. Probably that combination of genuine enthusiasm and shameless charm that had been getting Ron extra helpings since his first year at Hogwarts. She said it's special for Halloween, Ron explained through his first bite, offering the plate around. Something about traditional recipes and proper celebrations. Hermione took a small piece, examining it with the same care she might give an unknown potion ingredient. It tastes different, lighter somehow. There's something in it besides treacle. Honey from Honeydukes' own hives, said the wizard with the magnificent moustache, who had apparently decided their table was worthy of conversation. Old Ambrosius Flume keeps bees behind the shop, feeds them on enchanted flowers. The honey has a peculiar property, makes you receptive to truth, if you take my meaning. Harry paused with his own piece halfway to his mouth. What kind of truth? Nothing sinister, lad. Not like Veritaserum or any of that unpleasantness. Just opens the ears a bit, makes you listen properly. Good for a night of storytelling. The wizard winked. Though, if you'd rather not, I'm sure Rosmerta has plain biscuits somewhere. Ron, predictably, had already finished his portion and was reaching for another. Tastes brilliant either way. Hermione set hers down, but Harry noticed she didn't push it away entirely. After a moment's consideration, he ate his piece. It did taste lighter than normal treacle tart, with a floral undertone that seemed to clear his head, rather than fog it. The pub's sounds grew sharper, not louder, but more distinct. He could pick out individual conversations, the crackle of specific logs in the fire, the subtle melody of Rosmerta's humming as she worked behind the bar. Right then, announced a stout witch with robes the colour of autumn bracken. I'll tell you about the year the Shrieking Shack stopped shrieking. A ripple of interest moved through the pub. Even the portrait of what looked like a medieval innkeeper, hanging slightly crooked above the bar, seemed to lean forward in its frame. Harry felt himself tense slightly. The Shrieking Shack held particular memories, Sirius, Pettigrew, the truth about his parents' deaths spilling out in that dusty room. But this witch looked too old to be talking about recent history. Her story would come from further back. This would be, 60 years gone now, the witch said, confirming Harry's guess. I was a girl, maybe 14, working part-time at the Hogshead when Dumbledore was still just the Transfiguration Professor. Strange times they were. Grindelwald's shadow reaching even here, making everyone nervous about strangers and sudden noises. The fire dimmed slightly, as if responding to the mention of darker days. Harry noticed other patrons shifting in their seats. some too young to remember Grindelwald except as history, others old enough to have lived through those fears. The shack had been making its noises for years by then. Everyone knew to avoid it. Parents threatened children with it. Behave, or the Shrieking Shack monster will get you. That sort of thing. But then, one November morning, a girl from the village went missing. 10 years old, red hair, curious as a cat. Last seen playing near the forbidden forest edge. Hermione's hand found Harry's wrist, squeezing gently. They both knew what it was to fear for missing children, missing friends. Ron had gone very still, his usual restless energy frozen. The whole village turned out to search. Even Hogwarts students volunteered, though the headmaster at the time, Dippet that was, kept them close to the castle grounds. We looked everywhere, the forest edge, the mountain paths, the village shops and cellars. Nothing. 3 days she was gone, and with every hour, hope grew thinner. The witch paused, accepting a fresh mug of something that steamed in the cool air. Her hands wrapped around it with the care of someone remembering cold days spent searching. On the third night, the Shrieking Shack went quiet. Completely, utterly silent. And that silence was somehow worse than all the screaming had ever been. It felt wrong, like the world holding its breath. Old Phineas, not the Phineas from the portrait, his great-uncle, said we should check it, that if dark magic had taken the girl, it might have taken her there. But the shack was supposed to be. Hermione started, then stopped herself. Harry knew what she'd been about to say. The Shrieking Shack's reputation had been carefully constructed to keep people away during Remus's transformations. But 60 years ago, before the Marauders, before Remus had even been born, what had the shack actually been? Empty, the witch said, as if reading Hermione's thoughts. Just an abandoned house with a reputation. Or so everyone thought. But when the search party went in, and I wasn't allowed, being too young, but I heard about it after, they found the girl, asleep in an upstairs room, covered in dust and cobwebs, but completely unharmed, and beside her, the remains of some kind of protective circle, old magic, very old. Who cast it? Asked the young girl who'd spoken earlier, still perched on her father's lap. That's the mystery, little one. The girl couldn't remember how she got there. Said she'd been picking late-blooming roses near the forest, and then woke up in the shack with the search party around her. The protective circle used techniques that even Dumbledore admitted were ancient, pre-Hogwarts, founding, possibly. Someone or something had protected that child, kept her safe in a place known for danger. The witch smiled, and there was something both sad and hopeful in it. The shack started shrieking again after that, regular as clockwork. But some of us always wondered if maybe it had been protecting her all along. If those noises were warnings, stay away, stay safe. And for 3 days, it had focused all its energy on keeping one lost girl alive. Silence followed the story, contemplative rather than uncomfortable. Harry found himself thinking about protective magic, about how his mother's sacrifice had shielded him, about the wards around Hogwarts, about Creature's fierce loyalty to Regulus. Magic wasn't just spells and wand movements. Sometimes it was deeper, older, woven into places and purposes that outlasted the wizards who'd cast them. Did they ever find out who made the circle? Hermione asked, her scholarly curiosity overwhelming her usual politeness about interrupting. No, dear. Though Dumbledore spent some time examining it before it faded, he said something I've never forgotten. that the most powerful protective magic comes from intention, not incantation. Someone had wanted that place to be a sanctuary badly enough that the magic lingered for decades. Ron cleared his throat. Maybe it was Hengist. From the first story, if he put protection charms into Hogsmeade's foundations, maybe they extended to all the buildings, even abandoned ones. The elderly wizard with the long beard turned to regard Ron with new appreciation. The boy's got the right of it, I'd say. Magic doesn't follow property lines. It flows where it's needed, especially protective magic. Hengist made this place a refuge, and refuges don't stop at convenient boundaries. Harry felt something click in his mind, a connection between the founding story and this tale of unexpected protection. Both spoke of magic that persisted beyond its caster, that responded to need rather than just command. He thought of the room of requirement, appearing when desperately needed, of the castle staircases moving to help students who were late to class or blocking routes when danger lurked, of house elves appearing with cocoa and warm blankets when someone sat alone in the common room at 3 a.m, too haunted by nightmares to sleep. Hogwarts and Hogsmeade both had that quality. Magic that cared, in whatever way magic could care. Here's one that's lighter, called out a younger wizard, barely older than Harry himself. About the time my grandfather accidentally proposed to 3 different witches in one evening. The mood shifted gratefully toward laughter as the wizard spun a tale of confused love potions, mixed up Valentine's Day cards, and a grandfather whose magical incompetence was matched only by his completely mundane charm. It ended with him marrying none of the 3 witches, but instead the witch who'd helped him sort out the mess, Harry's grandmother, who'd found the whole situation hilarious and decided anyone that entertainingly disastrous needed supervision. More stories followed, lighter fare interspersed with moments of surprising depth. A tale about a shop cat that turned out to be an unregistered animagus who'd forgotten how to transform back and had decided she preferred her feline life anyway. An account of the time someone's filibuster's fireworks got loose during a Hogsmeade weekend and created an impromptu light show that rivaled anything the Weird Sisters had ever staged. Through it all, Harry noticed patterns emerging. Nearly every story, whether humorous or serious, touched on themes of belonging, of finding or making home, of the village as a place of refuge. Even the silly tale about the confused suitor ended with finding someone who accepted you, disasters and all. He caught Hermione's eye and saw she'd noticed too. Her expression was thoughtful, analytical in that way that meant she was cataloguing information for later examination. "It's like a theme," she murmured during a pause while someone fetched more drinks. "Every story connects back to Hogsmeade, a sanctuary. Maybe that's just what villages are," Ron suggested. "Places where people live and help each other out." "No, it's more than that," Hermione insisted. "Listen to the language they use. Refuge, protection, belonging. These aren't just stories about things that happened. They're stories about what this place means." Before Harry could respond, the elderly wizard who'd promised a tale from 40 years past rose again. The pub quieted instantly, that same shift in attention Harry had noticed earlier. The fire burned lower, as if conserving its light for something that needed proper darkness to be told right. "I'll speak now of 1953, the wizard said, his voice carrying weight beyond mere volume. The year after Tom Riddle left Hogwarts for what we all thought was the last time. Harry's hand tightened on his mug. Around the pub, reactions varied. Some patrons, too young to remember Voldemort's school days, looked merely curious, while others who'd lived through both wars grew still and watchful. We didn't know then what he'd become, of course. To us, he was just another brilliant student who'd gone off to seek his fortune. But that Halloween, the wizard paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. That Halloween, something happened at the castle. The wards flickered, just for a moment, but everyone in Hogsmeade felt it, like a cold wind through the soul. The enchanted leaves had stopped falling. Harry hadn't noticed them pause, but the air was suddenly still, waiting. Dumbledore came down from the castle himself. This was before he was head mastermind, still teaching Transfiguration, though everyone knew Dippet was barely holding the office. He went to every shop, every home, checking the protective enchantments, strengthening them where he could. And he said something to my father, who told me years later when I was old enough to understand. The wizard's eyes found Harry's across the room and held them. He said, "The darkness is coming back, and when it does, places like Hogsmeade will matter more than anyone knows. Keep your hearts warm, your doors open to those who need shelter, and your magic rooted in love rather than fear. Those will be the things that endure when power fails." Silence stretched through the pub, broken only by the fire's whisper. Harry felt the weight of those words, spoken in a different time about a threat most people hadn't yet recognized. Dumbledore had known. Even then, he'd known, and he'd been preparing sanctuaries. "Did he say what caused the wards to flicker?" Hermione asked, her voice careful. "No, but 3 days later, the Muggle newspapers reported a mysterious fire at an orphanage in London. Everyone inside was saved, but the building was destroyed. Make of that what you will." Harry's breath caught. The orphanage where Tom Riddle had grown up. He'd gone back there after leaving Hogwarts. Harry didn't know the exact timeline, but 3 days after a disturbance in Hogwarts wards seemed too coincidental. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked, though he thought he knew. The wizard's expression softened. "Because you need to understand, young Potter. The protection that kept you alive, that kept any of us alive through the dark times. It wasn't just one sacrifice, however powerful. It was layers. Generations of witches and wizards building sanctuaries, creating refuges, weaving protection into the very stones of places like this. Your mother's love saved you, yes, but Hogwarts kept you safe, and Hogsmeade sheltered you, and every hearth in every wizarding home that stayed lit through those dark years was part of the magic that let the light survive." Ron shifted uncomfortably beside Harry. They didn't usually talk about the war this directly, not in public spaces. But the wizard wasn't finished. "These stories we tell every Halloween, they're not just entertainment. They're reminders, they're renewals. Every time we speak of Hengist's intention, of the Shrieking Shack's unexpected protection, of Dumbledore's warning, we're reinforcing the magic. We're saying, this place matters. This place is worth protecting. This place will shelter those who need it." Madame Rosmerta appeared beside the wizard, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "That's enough weight for one story, Malcolm. Let's have something lighter before the evening grows too heavy." Malcolm nodded, seeming suddenly tired. As he sat back down, the enchanted leaves began falling again, their gentle descent restoring some of the evening's earlier ease. But Harry felt as if he'd been given a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. A shopkeeper stood to tell a story about a confused boggart that kept trying to transform into people's fondest wishes instead of their worst fears, causing all sorts of chaos when people found themselves confronted with puppies and birthday cakes instead of monsters. The laughter that followed was genuine, grateful, a release of the tension Malcolm's story had created. But Harry remained aware of something building beneath the surface. These weren't random tales told for entertainment. They were connected, deliberate, each one adding to some larger tapestry he was only beginning to see. "You're thinking too hard," Ron said, nudging him. "I can actually hear your brain working from here. Don't you think it's strange?" Harry asked. "All these stories, the way they fit together." "I think it's Halloween in a wizarding village," Ron replied practically. "Strange, pretty much. Comes with the territory. But if it bothers you that much, we can leave." "No," Harry said quickly. "No, I want to stay. I want to hear the rest." Because there would be more. He was certain of that. The evening had its own momentum now, carrying them towards something. And Harry had learned long ago that sometimes the only way through mystery was forward, even when, especially when, you didn't know where you were going. Hermione was watching him with concern and curiosity in equal measure. "We'll stay as long as you want," she said simply. The fire crackled in agreement, and somewhere in its heart, Harry thought he saw shapes dancing, a mother bending over a crib, an old wizard strengthening wards, a village full of lights in the darkness. But when he blinked, there was only flame, ordinary and warm, keeping the October cold at bay. The treacle tart had long since disappeared, claimed by Ron's methodical appreciation and the surprisingly hearty appetite of the witch, with autumn-coloured robes sitting at the next table. Harry found himself nursing his fourth, or was it fifth? Butterbeer, the warmth of it spreading through his chest in a way that had little to do with temperature and everything to do with the honey flume's enchanted bees had gathered. His ears felt open, receptive, as if the pub itself was speaking in frequencies he'd never quite heard before. The evening had reached that comfortable middle point where inhibitions loosened and stories flowed more freely. A wizard with paint-stained fingers, likely from Dervish and the Banshees, judging by the smell of wood polish that clung to him, was recounting the time a shipment of self-shuffling playing cards had gained unexpected sentience and attempted to organize a revolution in his shop. Wanted better working conditions, if you can believe it, he said, shaking his head with a mixture of exasperation and fondness. The kings were particularly militant. The queens just wanted more decorative packaging. Laughter rippled through the gathering, but Harry noticed something underneath it, a current of meaning he couldn't quite catch. The story was amusing on its surface, but there was something else there. Something about objects taking on life from the intentions of their creators, about magic pooling in unexpected places. He was definitely thinking too hard. Ron was right about that. "Your turn, young Weasley," called Madame Rosmerta, appearing beside their table with the effortlessness of someone who'd been navigating crowded spaces since before Harry was born. "You've been sitting there consuming my butterbeer for an hour. Time to pay in stories." Ron nearly choked on his current mug. Me? I don't know any. I mean, nothing interesting has ever. Tell them about nearly headless Nick, Hermione suggested, a small smile playing at her lips. The time he helped you find your way, when you were lost. That's not really a story, Ron protested, but the pub had already turned its attention toward him. There was no escaping now. Harry recognized the trapped look on his friend's face, the same expression Ron got when called on in class, despite not having his hand raised. Right, Ron said, setting down his mug and wiping his palms on his robes. This was, what, 4th year? Maybe 5th. Anyway, I was heading to the library. The library? Someone interrupted with exaggerated disbelief. Hermione made me, Ron said defensively, which got another laugh. We had that essay on the Goblin Rebellions, and she said I needed actual books, not just copying her notes. So I was trying to take a shortcut, because the staircases had decided to be particularly unhelpful that day, and I ended up in a corridor I'd never seen before. Harry leaned forward slightly. He'd heard this story, or part of it, but not like this. Not with Ron telling it to a room full of strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers at all. It was properly odd. Ron continued, warming to the tale now. All the portraits were turned around backward, and the torches were burning blue instead of orange. I tried to go back the way I came, but the corridor had changed. You know how the castle gets sometimes, like it's having a laugh at your expense. Nods of understanding from older patrons. Every Hogwarts student knew that feeling, of the castle deciding to rearrange itself around you. I was starting to properly panic, thinking maybe I'd walked into some kind of trap or cursed section, when nearly headless Nick came floating through a wall, and he looked at me with this expression, like he'd been expecting me, said, "Ah, Mr. Weasley, the castle thought you might need guidance," just like that, as if the castle thought things. "It does," murmured the elderly wizard with the long beard. "Anyone who spent time there knows it does." "Yeah, well, I was just learning that," Ron said. Nick led me through this maze of corridors, telling me about the time he got lost in 1492 and didn't find his way out for 3 days. Made me feel a bit better about being turned around for half an hour. And then he said something that stuck with me. Ron paused, and Harry could see him searching for the exact words, wanting to get them right. He said, "The castle never leads students where they're not meant to be. Only sometimes where they need to be is different from where they want to be." And sure enough, we didn't end up at the library. We ended up at the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey was treating this first year who'd been hit with a nasty jinx. The kid was crying, scared out of his mind, and there was no one there to sit with him. His friends were all in class. The pub had gone very quiet. Even the fire seemed to be listening. "So I sat with him," Ron said simply. "Told him about the time Fred and George turned my teddy bear into a spider when I was 3. Made him laugh a bit. Madame Pomfrey gave me a lemon drop and said I could visit the library later. And when I finally got there, I found the exact book I needed sitting on a table, already opened to the right page. The castle knew," Hermione said softly. "Knew that the first year needed someone, and knew you'd help if you were there." "Yeah, I suppose." Ron looked embarrassed now, colour rising in his ears. "Point is, Nick said the castle's full of ghosts who remember what it's like to be alive, to be lost, to need help. And they work with the castle itself to look after students. It's not just stone and magic. It's, I don't know, it's caring, if buildings can care. Malcolm, the wizard who'd spoken of Dumbledore's warning, nodded slowly. They can care, lad. When enough intention is poured into them, when enough love and fear and hope soak into the stones, places become alive in ways we don't fully understand. Hogwarts has had 1,000 years of students feeling lost and found, scared and safe, alone and befriended. That magic doesn't just disappear. Harry felt something tighten in his chest. He'd always known Hogwarts was special, but hearing it articulated like this, hearing that the castle's protective instincts weren't just wards and spells, but something deeper, more fundamental, made him understand why he'd always thought of the castle as home in a way that number 4, Privet Drive, never could be. "That's a good story, Ron," said Madame Rosmerta, her voice warm with approval. "Your turn, Miss Granger. What does the cleverest witch of her age have to share?" Hermione looked startled, then thoughtful. Her fingers drummed against her mug in that particular pattern that meant she was organizing thoughts into proper narrative structure. "I'm not sure it's a proper story," she began, "but there was something that happened in second year that I have never quite understood." Harry knew immediately which story she was going to tell. He saw her hand drift unconsciously to her neck, where no trace remained of the fur that had grown there after the Polyjuice accident. "I was in the hospital wing after a potions accident," Hermione said, carefully not specifying what kind of accident. This was during all the trouble with the Chamber of Secrets. "I was terrified, not just of being attacked, but of being useless. I couldn't help solve the mystery if I was stuck in bed covered in..." She paused. "Well, it doesn't matter what I was covered in." A few knowing chuckles suggested some in the audience had heard about Hermione's mishap with the Polyjuice potion, but no one interrupted. "I couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like a basilisk, every sound like something slithering through pipes. And then the castle did something extraordinary. The portrait nearest my bed, it was just some random witch from the 17th century, started talking to me. Really talking, not just answering questions. She told me about the time she'd been stuck in the hospital wing for weeks after a transfiguration accident turned her temporarily into a teapot." Ron snorted. "A teapot?" "She was attempting human-to-object transformation without proper preparation," Hermione said primly. "The theoretical foundation was sound, but the execution, anyway, that's not the point. The point is, she talked to me for hours. And then other portraits joined in. The witch's friends from other paintings, former students who'd visited the hospital wing, even a very grumpy wizard who claimed to have invented the sleeping draught. Ghoulstone Greengrass," murmured Madame Rosmerta, still bitter about not getting proper credit even 300 years later. "They kept me company until I fell asleep," Hermione continued. "And when I woke up, I realized something. The castle wasn't just protecting us from physical harm with its wards, it was protecting us from fear, from loneliness, from feeling abandoned. Every portrait, every ghost, every torch that burns a bit brighter when you're scared, it's all part of the same magic, the same intention that Hengist built into Hogsmeade." She looked directly at the elderly wizard who told the story of the village's founding. "You said he built every door with welcome, every hearth with warmth. Hogwarts is the same. Every portrait has company to offer. Every corridor has a way forward, even when you're lost. It's architecture of compassion. The phrase hung in the air, architecture of compassion. Harry felt it resonate through him, through the pub itself. He thought of all the times the castle had sheltered him, not just from Voldemort or Death Eaters, but from his own despair. The way the house elves always knew when he needed food after a nightmare. The way the fat lady never scolded him for late-night wanderings. The way the Room of Requirement had given Dumbledore's army exactly what they needed when they needed it most. "Well said, Miss Granger," Malcolm said quietly. "Architecture of compassion. I like that very much." A witch Harry didn't recognize stood then, her silver hair braided with what looked like dried lavender. "I'll tell you something from further back still. From the Marauders' time at Hogwarts, when James Potter and his friends were making their mischief." Harry's attention sharpened immediately. Ron and Hermione both glanced at him, but he kept his expression neutral. His father was always a complicated subject, the man he'd never known except through stories, half of them praising his bravery, the other half condemning his bullying. "I was working in the Three Broomsticks back then," the witch said. "Just a girl, really, learning the trade from Rosmerta's predecessor. Those 4 boys came in every Hogsmeade weekend, regular as clockwork. Potter, Black Lupin, and Pettigrew." She said the last name without judgment, just as part of the list. They were loud, full of themselves the way teenage boys are. But there was something else about them. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. Harry found himself holding his breath. Lupin, the quiet one, the one who looked tired all the time. He'd sometimes come in alone on the days after full moons. Never ordered much, just tea and toast. And he'd sit in the corner looking lost, like he was trying to remember how to be human. Harry's throat tightened. He'd seen Remus look like that in the days after transformations, that bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. One of those times, he'd forgotten his coin purse, probably left it in whatever safe house he'd transformed in. He was mortified, started apologizing profusely, saying he'd come back with payment. But Potter had already been there that morning, hours before Lupin arrived. He'd left payment for 2 meals and a note for whoever served his friend. I still remember what it said. "For Moony. Extra toast. He'll need it." Something warm bloomed in Harry's chest. He'd heard so many stories about his father's arrogance, his casual cruelty to Snape. But this quiet care for a friend who was suffering, felt more real somehow, more complete. "That happened more than once," the witch continued. "Potter always knew when Lupin would need help, and he made sure it was there. Never made a fuss about it, never sought credit, just took care of his friend. That's the James Potter I remember. Not the show-off who hexed people in corridors, but the boy who paid for extra toast." "Both can be true," said an older wizard Harry hadn't noticed before, sitting in the shadows near the back. "People contain multitudes. Potter was arrogant and brave, foolish and loyal, cruel and kind. That's what it means to be human, to be all those things at once and to choose in each moment which part of yourself you'll feed." The observation settled over the gathering with the weight of wisdom earned through experience. Harry thought about the choices he'd made, the times he'd been generous and the times he'd been harsh. He thought about Snape, whose cruelty and courage had both been real, about Dumbledore, whose manipulation and love had coexisted, about himself and the darkness he carried alongside the light. The castle knew, Hermione said suddenly. It had to know. The wards would have been aware of Remus's condition, of the danger he posed during full moons. But it sheltered him anyway, created the Shrieking Shack as a place for him to transform safely. Let him continue his education when most schools would have expelled him. That's the same protective magic we keep talking about. Magic that sees the whole person and chooses compassion. The Shrieking Shack, Ron said slowly. The one from the earlier story. The one that protected the lost girl decades before Lupin ever used it. The same, confirmed the witch with lavender-braided hair. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the building itself remembered its original purpose, sanctuary, and continued serving it, just in different ways for different needs. Harry felt the pieces clicking together more firmly now. Every story tonight had touched on protection, on places and magic that chose to shelter rather than harm, to include rather than exclude. From Hengist's founding intentions to the Shrieking Shack's dual purpose, from the castle's living awareness to the portrait's companionship, it was all the same magic, expressed in different forms. You're seeing it now, Malcolm said, those sharp old eyes fixed on Harry. The pattern, the thread that runs through everything. What is it? Harry asked. What are you trying to tell us? Not tell you, lad. Show you. Let you discover it the way all important things must be discovered, not by being told, but by understanding. Malcolm leaned forward, his face serious. These stories aren't random. They're chosen. Every Halloween, we tell the ones that matter most, the ones that reinforce what Hogsmeade and Hogwarts truly are. And every time we tell them, the magic grows a bit stronger. The protection deepens. The sanctuary becomes more certain. It's a ritual, Hermione breathed. Not in the dark magic sense, but in the anthropological one. A community reinforcing its values and its protective magic through shared narrative. Exactly so, Miss Granger. Malcolm smiled. And you three are part of it now. Your stories, your experiences of being sheltered and choosing to shelter others. They're woven into the magic just like everyone else's. Harry looked around the pub with new eyes. Every person here, from the youngest child to the oldest wizard, was participating in something ancient and ongoing. They were maintaining the refuge that Hengist had created, that Dumbledore had strengthened, that 1,000 years of intention had built into these stones. There are more stories yet, Madame Rosmerta said, refilling mugs with that endlessly pouring pitcher. The night's still young, and the best tales come in the deeper darkness. Who's next? A wizard with the distinctive green apron of a herbology specialist stood, beginning a story about a particularly stubborn, venomous tentacula that had become deeply attached to its student caretaker. But Harry barely heard it. His mind was still spinning, connecting threads, seeing patterns in everything from the enchanted autumn leaves to the way the fire never seemed to need more logs, but kept burning steadily all the same. Ron nudged him. You all right? Yeah, Harry said softly. I think I'm beginning to understand something important. Care to share with the class? Harry shook his head. Not yet. I need to hear the rest first. There's more coming. I can feel it. And there was. The evening had its own momentum, its own purpose. Whatever revelation was building toward them through these carefully chosen tales, Harry knew they hadn't reached it yet, but they were getting close. The fire crackled agreement, and in its heart, Harry saw shapes dancing once more. A stag, a doe, a wolf, and something else, something new, being born from the gathered stories and shared intention. He blinked, and the shapes scattered into ordinary flame. But the feeling remained. Something was coming. Something that would make sense of everything they'd heard tonight. All they had to do was keep listening. The herbology specialist's tale had wound to a satisfying conclusion. The venomous tentacula, it turned out, had been protecting a nest of bowtruckles that had taken up residence in its pot, which explained its unusual aggression toward anyone who tried to transplant it. The story earned appreciative murmurs about the unexpected compassion of dangerous plants, which seemed to fit the evening's pattern so perfectly that Harry wondered if every story told in this pub on Halloween night somehow bent itself towards themes of protection and sanctuary. The enchanted autumn leaves had begun falling in more complex patterns now, spiraling around each other in pairs and trios before vanishing. Harry watched two oak leaves dance together, their paths intertwining until he couldn't tell which was which, and thought about friendship, about how people's lives tangled together until separation became impossible. Mr. Potter? Madame Rosmerta's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient conversation with the precision of a well-aimed spell. The pub quieted instantly, expectantly. Harry felt the weight of every eye turning towards him and resisted the urge to sink lower in his chair. "We've heard from your friends," Rosmerta continued, her expression warm but implacable. "Stories about the castle's care, about companionship in darkness. But you've been quiet all evening, listening, but not sharing. And I think you—" She paused, glancing at Malcolm, at the witch with lavender-braided hair, at faces Harry recognized and many he didn't. "I think we'd all like to hear from the boy who lived in the cupboard and found his way home." Heat flooded Harry's face. He didn't like being called that the boy who lived. Didn't like the reminder of how much everyone knew about him without knowing him at all. But he also heard what she wasn't saying, the invitation beneath the words. Not to perform, not to be famous Harry Potter, but to contribute honestly to whatever magic they were building here tonight. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Everything that's happened to me, it's all mixed up with the war, with fighting. I'm not sure I have stories like the ones you've been telling, gentle ones about getting lost and being found." "Tell them about the burrow," Hermione said quietly. "The first time you saw it." Harry glanced at Ron, who shrugged with a small smile. "It's a good memory, and it fits, doesn't it? What everyone's been talking about." Harry took a long drink of butterbeer, letting the warmth settle into his chest while he organized his thoughts. The pub waited with the patience of stone, of ancient timber, of magic that had learned to give people the time they needed. "I didn't know places like the burrow existed," he finally began. "I mean, I knew magical families lived somewhere, but I'd never thought about what their homes might be like. The Dursleys' house was all straight lines and matching furniture and nothing out of place. Everything designed to look normal, to blend in, to not attract attention. He could picture it so clearly. And before, Privet Drive, with its ruthlessly maintained lawn and its absolute ordinariness, a house built to keep magic out, to deny anything that didn't fit into Aunt Petunia's narrow view of acceptable reality. When Ron rescued me in the flying car, second year after Dobby got me locked out, we flew for hours. I kept waiting for us to land in some normal-looking neighborhood, maybe with slightly odd garden gnomes or something. But then we came over this hill, and there it was. The memory bloomed in his mind with perfect clarity. Dawn light touching the burrow's crooked chimney stacks, the house itself seeming to defy physics, with how it leaned and twisted, held together by magic and love more than architecture. It looked like it had grown there, Harry said, searching for words. Like someone had planted a seed of home, and this is what sprouted. Nothing matched. Every room seemed to have been added when it was needed, stuck on wherever there was space. The whole thing should have collapsed, probably would have if it were a Muggle building, but it stood there solid and real, with chickens in the yard and a pond with algae and washing hanging on a line, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Ron made an embarrassed sound. It's a mess, really. Mum's always apologizing for how cramped it is. It's not a mess, Harry said firmly. It's alive. The Dursleys' house was like a museum. You weren't supposed to touch anything or make noise or exist too loudly. But the burrow was different. Every wall had marks on it, from kids growing up. Every room smelled like something. Cooking or wood polish or the garden or Ron's Chudley Cannons poster that he'd used too much Spello tape on. A few people chuckled at that, and Harry felt himself relaxing into the story. Mrs. Weasley came out when she heard the car, and she was furious, absolutely livid that Ron had stolen the car and flown it without permission. But then she saw me. And before she even finished scolding Ron, she was asking if I'd had breakfast. And when I said no, she dragged us both inside and started cooking. He could smell it now, the memory so vivid. It might have been yesterday. Bacon and eggs and toast. Proper breakfast that hadn't come from a too small portion, grudgingly shoved at him through Dudley's cast-off portions. I sat at this enormous wooden table with scorch marks and knife scratches and initials carved into it, and Mrs. Weasley put food in front of me, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I belonged there. And then Mr. Weasley came in. He'd been dealing with the car, making sure it hadn't damaged anything in the garage, and instead of being angry at me for being part of the whole mess, he asked if I wanted to see his collection of Muggle plugs. Laughter rippled through the pub, fond and familiar. Everyone seemed to know Arthur Weasley's fascination with Muggle artifacts. But the thing that really got me, Harry continued, his voice softer now, was the clock in the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley's clock, with the hands for each family member. They were all set to home that morning, except for Percy, who was at work, and Charlie, who was in Romania. And I remember thinking, there's a whole category just for home on that clock. Not specific locations, just home. Because for the Weasleys, that mattered more than coordinates. Where you were physically mattered less than whether you were safe, whether you were where you belonged. He paused, swallowing past the unexpected tightness in his throat. I'd never had that before. Never had someone checking whether I was home, whether I was safe. The Dursleys would have been thrilled if my hand had permanently stuck on lost or in mortal peril. But at the Burrow, there was this whole magical object dedicated to the idea that family should know if you're all right. That caring about each other's safety was important enough to build magic around. Hermione's hand found his under the table, squeezing gently. Ron was studying his empty mug with intense focus, his ears red. "I didn't understand it then," Harry said. "Not fully. I thought it was just nice, the way things in storybooks are nice. But now I think—" He looked around the pub, at the floating candles and the warm fire and the faces watching him with understanding. "Now I think the burrow is what Hengist was trying to build in Hogsmeade, what Hogwarts became over centuries. It's a place where the magic itself is designed around the idea that people matter more than perfection, where the protection isn't just wards and spells, but the daily choice to care, to check the clock, to cook breakfast for unexpected guests, to make room for one more person at the table, even when it's already crowded." "That's the heart of it," Malcolm said, his old voice carrying satisfaction. "You've understood exactly right, Mr. Potter. The most powerful protective magic isn't in the big heroic sacrifices, though those matter too. It's in the daily small choices. The extra toast, the clock hand checking for home, the portrait staying awake to keep a frightened student company. The seat saved by the fire," added Madame Rosmerta, gesturing to their table. "The butterbeer poured before it's requested. The door that's always unlocked for those who need shelter." Harry felt something shift in his understanding. All evening, he'd been hearing about grand moments. Hengist founding the village, Dumbledore strengthening wards, the Shrieking Shack protecting a lost girl. But those moments had grown from something smaller, something daily, from countless tiny decisions to care, to include, to make space for one more person who needed belonging. "Your turn next, I think," said a voice Harry didn't recognize. A young witch, maybe just out of Hogwarts herself, was smiling at him nervously. "But this one's mine first. It's about the time I nearly got expelled, and Professor McGonagall saved me." The story that followed was both humorous and touching. A transfiguration accident involving a teacup, a turtle, and an unfortunate sneeze that had resulted in something that should never have existed and had taken 3 professors to safely untransfigure. McGonagall had been furious, the witch explained, but she'd also fought the Board of Governors' recommendation for expulsion, arguing that magical accidents were part of learning and that perfect safety was impossible in education. The real lesson was how to handle mistakes with grace and responsibility. "She made me write apology letters to everyone affected," the witch said, including the turtle, which felt ridiculous until I realized she was teaching me that all creatures deserve respect, even when they're temporarily confused about their species. And she personally supervised my extra transfiguration practice for a month, making sure I understood the theory before I touched a wand to anything again. "That's McGonagall," Ron said with feeling, terrifying and protective at the same time, like having a very strict mother lion. "Exactly." The young witch beamed. "She cares so much, but she shows it through high standards, through refusing to let you be less than you're capable of being. That's protection too, isn't it? Not just keeping people safe from external danger, but helping them become the kind of people who can keep themselves safe." Hermione sat up straighter, her scholarly interest clearly piqued. "That's an excellent point. Protective magic isn't just defensive wards. It's education, mentorship, the passing on of knowledge that helps people survive and thrive." "Which brings us back to stories," said the lavender-haired witch. "Why we tell them, why they matter. we're not just entertaining each other or passing time. We're teaching, reminding ourselves and each other what matters, what we value, what kind of community we want to be. Every year, Madame Rosmerta added, moving through the pub to refill mugs. Every Halloween, we gather and tell these tales. Some are the same stories we've told for decades. Some are new, but they all reinforce the same truth. This place is a sanctuary, and we keep it that way through intention and choice. Harry watched her pour, watched the butterbeer flow in a steady stream that never seemed to deplete the pitcher, and thought about magic that sustained itself through use rather than exhausting itself. The Burrows clock that never needed winding, the Hogwarts kitchens that always had food, the protective wards that grew stronger the more people sheltered within them. I have a story, he said suddenly, surprising himself. Another one. From the war. The pub quieted again, but this time the quality of silence was different, heavier. People leaned forward, sensing something important coming. There was a night during 7th year when Hermione, Ron, and I were on the run. We'd been camping for months, moving constantly, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. We were cold and hungry and arguing, because that's what happened when you're 17 and terrified and responsible for saving the world when you have no idea how. He felt Ron tense beside him, Hermione's hand tighten on his. They'd survived those months, but the memory still had sharp edges. We'd set up camp in a forest. I don't even remember which one now. They all blurred together. Hermione had cast the usual protection spells, but they felt thin, like we were hiding behind paper instead of walls. And I was on watch, sitting outside the tent, convinced Death Eaters were about to find us any second. The fire crackled, sending up sparks. Harry watched them rise and thought about darker fires, the kind that destroyed instead of warming. Then I heard something moving in the trees. I grabbed my wand, ready to fight or run or die trying. But what came out of the darkness wasn't Death Eaters. It was a doe, a silver doe, made of light. He heard the sharp intake of breath from several listeners. They knew this story, or parts of it. Everyone knew about Snape's doe, about the Patronus that had led Harry to the sword. It wasn't threatening. It was beautiful, and it wanted me to follow it, which seemed like the worst idea possible. Every instinct said it was a trap, but there was something about it, something that felt like... He struggled for words. Like protection, like my mother. I followed it to a frozen pond, and at the bottom was the sword we needed, the sword I had to retrieve, even though getting it nearly killed me. Ron shifted uncomfortably. That part of the story was his, diving in to save Harry, destroying the Horcrux, proving his courage when it mattered most. I didn't know until much later who sent the doe. Didn't know it was Snape, who loved my mother his entire life and protected me because of that love, even while hating me for looking like my father. But here's what I've been thinking about tonight, listening to all your stories. Harry looked around the pub, meeting eyes, holding gazes. Snape's protection wasn't kind. It wasn't gentle or warm or any of the things we've been talking about. He was cruel to me, played favorites, made my school years harder than they needed to be. But he also kept me alive, kept me safe, worked against Voldemort from the inside, risked his life daily, and ultimately died to give me the information I needed to end the war. Both things can be true, said the wizard from earlier, the one who'd spoken about people containing multitudes. He was cruel and protective. Those aren't contradictions, they're complexity. Yes, Harry agreed. And I think maybe that's part of what tonight is about. Understanding that protection comes in different forms. That sanctuary isn't always comfortable. That sometimes the magic that keeps you alive is harsh and difficult, but it's still magic that chooses life over death, hope over despair. Malcolm nodded slowly. The castle protects with warm fires and with locked doors, with soft beds and with trials that test you, with kindness and with strict discipline. All of it matters. All of it is necessary. The burrow taught me what home could feel like, Harry said. Warm and welcoming and full of love. But Snape taught me that protection doesn't always look like love. Sometimes it looks like someone you hate standing between you and death, over and over, for reasons you won't understand until it's too late to thank them. Silence settled over the gathering, contemplative and deep. The floating candles dimmed slightly, and the enchanted leaves stopped falling entirely, as if the pub itself was absorbing the weight of what had been said. Then Hermione spoke, her voice clear and firm. I have one more story, about the night we brought everyone back to Hogwarts for the final battle. Harry turned to her, surprised. They didn't talk about that night often. It was too big, too heavy, too full of loss. The castle was damaged, Hermione continued. Walls broken, towers crumbling, evidence of fights and dark magic everywhere. It should have felt like a ruin. But when we came back, when we brought the Order and Dumbledore's army and everyone willing to fight, the castle responded. Her eyes were distant, remembering. The room of requirement opened for everyone who needed shelter. The portraits organized themselves into a communication network, passing messages about Death Eater movements. The suits of armor literally marched to defend the walls. Even the house elves came up from the kitchens, armed with knives and determination. The castle wasn't passive. It fought with us. It chose to protect its students one more time, even when those students were walking into war. Because that's what Hogwarts does, Ron added quietly. It's not just a school. It's a promise that you'll be protected while you learn how to protect yourself and others, that you'll be given time to grow strong enough to face what's coming. And that night, the castle kept that promise. Even knowing many of us wouldn't survive, it gave us every advantage it could. It fought for us because we were fighting for it. Harry felt tears prick his eyes. He'd never articulated it that way, but Ron was right. The castle had fought alongside them, had been not just a battlefield, but an ally, a defender, a home defending its family. That's why we're here tonight, Malcolm said softly. Not just to remember those who died, though we honor them, but to remember why we fought, what we were protecting. Places like Hogsmeade and Hogwarts, where magic chooses compassion, where sanctuary is built into the foundations, where even in darkness there are lights burning to guide people home. Madame Rosmerta raised her mug. To the fallen, to the survivors, to the sanctuaries that shelter us all. To sanctuary, the pub echoed, and Harry raised his own mug with everyone else, feeling the words resonate through him like a spell, like a promise, like coming home after a very long journey. The fire blazed brighter, and for just a moment, Harry could have sworn he saw faces in the flames. Sirius, Lupin, Tonks, Fred, all those who died defending home. Not sad faces, but approving ones, proud ones. Then the moment passed, and there was only firelight, warm and steady, keeping the darkness at bay. The pub had grown quieter after the trio's stories, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that settled over people who had shared something meaningful and needed time to absorb it. The enchanted autumn leaves had resumed their gentle descent, moving slower now, as if they too were contemplating what had been said. Harry found himself watching them with a kind of detached fascination, his mind still half caught in memories of the final battle, of the castle fighting alongside them, of Snape's silver doe leading him through darkness. Madame Rosmerta moved through the gathering with her endless pitcher of butterbeer, refilling mugs without being asked, occasionally resting a hand on someone's shoulder in silent understanding. The fire had settled into a steady, purposeful burn, its light painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Outside the windows, true night had fallen, not the blue-grey twilight of early evening, but the deep velvet darkness of Halloween midnight approaching. "The hour grows late," said the elderly witch who had told the first story, her voice soft but carrying. "And we've reached the part of the evening when the deepest truths may be spoken, when the veil is thinnest, not just between living and dead, but between surface and substance." Harry felt a shift in the room's energy, subtle but unmistakable. The conversations that had been murmuring in corners ceased entirely. Every person present turned their attention to the old witch, and Harry realized with a start that this had been planned all along. Every story tonight had been leading somewhere, building towards something, and they were finally about to discover what. "You've heard many tales this evening," the witch continued, her apple-carved face serious in the firelight, "about Hengist's founding, about the Shrieking Shack's protection, about Dumbledore's warnings and Potter's doe, about clocks that track family and castles that fight for their students. And young Mr. Potter asked earlier what we were trying to tell him." She smiled, ancient and knowing. "Now we come to the answer." Malcolm rose from his seat with the careful dignity of old age, moving to stand beside the witch. Then the lavender-haired woman joined them, and the wizard with paint-stained fingers, and Madame Rosmerta herself, leaving her endless pitcher on the bar. One by one, the older patrons, those who had been telling most of the stories, formed a loose circle near the fire. "Every year on Halloween," Malcolm began, "this gathering happens. Not by formal arrangement, but by something deeper, a calling, if you will. Those who are meant to be here find their way here, drawn by magic so old and fundamental that few remember its name. The magic of sanctuary," said the lavender-haired witch, "the magic that Hengist invoked when he built the first homes in this valley, that the Hogwarts founders wove into their castle, that exists in every hearth and threshold, where intention has been set toward protection and welcome." Hermione leaned forward, her analytical mind clearly racing. "You're saying this gathering is ritual magic? That by telling these specific stories, you're actively maintaining the protective enchantments on Hogsmeade?" "Partly right, Miss Granger," the old witch said approvingly. "But it's more than maintenance. It's renewal, it's teaching, and most importantly, it's transfer." "Transfer?" Harry asked, though something in him already knew the answer, had been circling it all evening without quite grasping it. "The magic of sanctuary doesn't belong to places," Madame Rosmerta explained, her voice taking on a quality Harry had never heard from her before, ancient, ceremonial, weighted with significance. It belongs to people, to those who choose to create and maintain spaces of refuge, to those who understand that protection is both a gift and a responsibility. She gestured to the circle of older storytellers. We are the current keepers of Hogsmeade's sanctuary magic. We maintain it through intention, through daily choices, through the stories we tell that reinforce what this place is meant to be. But we're not immortal. Magic like this needs to be passed on, taught to the next generation who will carry it forward. Harry's heart began to beat faster. That's why you wanted us here tonight. Why you wanted us to tell our stories. You and countless others over the years, Malcolm confirmed. Every Halloween, we tell the old tales and invite new stories. We listen for those who understand, who carry the same intention in their hearts. And when we find them, we teach them. We show them how to maintain the magic, how to strengthen it, how to pass it on in turn. But why us specifically? Ron asked, bewildered. I mean, Harry's famous and all, but Hermione and you're the ones who rebuilt the Burrow's clock when it was destroyed in the war. The lavender-haired witch interrupted gently. You, Ronald Weasley, spent 3 months getting it working again, learning the charms from your mother, adding new hands for friends who'd become family. You understand that protection is about knowing where people are, about caring enough to track whether they're safe. Ron flushed, clearly surprised that anyone knew about that. Harry hadn't known. Ron had done it quietly, without fanfare, in those first confused months after the war, when everyone was trying to piece their lives back together. The old witch turned to Hermione. And you, Hermione Granger, have spent the last year working to improve house elf rights, not through legislation, but through relationship, teaching and learning, finding ways to honor their magic while offering choice. You understand that protection isn't about control, but about creating conditions where all beings can thrive. Hermione's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Her work with house elves had been frustrating and slow, full of setbacks and misunderstandings. Hearing it recognized as important, as connected to this larger magic of sanctuary, seemed to overwhelm her. And you, Harry Potter, Malcolm said, his voice infinitely gentle. You who have been protected and protect to both, who learned from the Burrow what home could be, who carried that knowledge into darkness and used it to light the way for others, who chose, again and again, to shelter rather than abandon, to include rather than exclude. You understand sanctuary in your bones, because you've lived without it and fought to create it for others. Harry couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his chest too full of emotions he couldn't name. He'd never thought of himself that way, as someone who created sanctuary. He'd just done what seemed necessary, what felt right, protected those who needed protecting, made space for those who had none. The magic recognizes you, the elderly witch said softly. All three of you. You already carry it, whether you knew it or not. Tonight is simply making conscious what has always been true. You are sanctuary keepers in your own ways and places. And now we're teaching you how to do it intentionally. How? Hermione asked, her voice shaking slightly. How do we maintain this magic? What are we supposed to do? Madame Rosmerta smiled. What you've already been doing, dear, but with awareness now, with understanding of how it connects to the larger whole. She gestured to the circle of elders. Each of us maintain sanctuary in our own way. I keep the Three Broomsticks as a place of welcome, where the door is never locked to those who need shelter, where the butterbeer never runs out and the fire never dies. Malcolm strengthens the wards around the village, walks the boundaries, ensures that protective intentions remain strong in the stones and soil. I tend the memories, said the lavender-haired witch. I collect the stories, preserve them, make sure the history of this place's protection is never forgotten. Because remembering is part of maintaining. Magic fades when people forget why it exists. I repair, added the wizard with paint-stained fingers. Not just furniture and buildings, but the small magics woven into them. The warming charms on doorsteps, the welcome enchantments on thresholds, the protective runes hidden in foundations. Physical maintenance of sanctuary spaces. One by one, the elders described their roles. Gardening with intention to keep the land healthy and responsive. Teaching young wizards and witches about protective magic. Maintaining relationships with the magical creatures who lived nearby. Keeping records of who needed help and ensuring they received it. Each role was different, but all served the same purpose, maintaining Hogsmeade as a place of refuge. And now we're asking you to join this work, Malcolm said. Not to replace us. We'll continue as long as we're able. But to expand the circle, to bring your own gifts and understanding, to help ensure that when we're gone, the magic continues. But we don't live in Hogsmeade, Harry protested. I'm still at Hogwarts, and after, I don't know where I'll be. Sanctuary magic isn't bound by geography, the old witch explained. Hogwarts and Hogsmeade have always been connected, part of the same protective network. What strengthens one strengthens the other, and sanctuary keepers can be anywhere. The burrow is a sanctuary, after all, and it's miles from here. What matters is the intention, the choice to create and maintain spaces of refuge wherever you are. She leaned forward, her ancient eyes intense. Think about what you've learned tonight. Hengist built sanctuary into foundations. The castle fights for its students. The burrow's clock tracks family. Snape's doe protected even through hatred. McGonagall teaches through high standards. The portraits offer company. The house elves serve with care. Every one of these is a different expression of the same magic. The magic that says, you matter, you're safe here, you belong. And you already practice this magic, added Madame Rosmerta. Harry, you've been creating sanctuary for others since you were 11 years old, befriending the lonely, protecting the vulnerable, standing between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. That's sanctuary work. Ron, you've been doing it too, said Malcolm, making space at your family's table for those who had none. Using humor to ease fear, standing beside your friends even when it was dangerous, rebuilding the clock that tracks home, all sanctuary work. Hermione, your entire approach to magic is about creating conditions for thriving, the lavender-haired witch said warmly. Protecting house elves' rights, teaching others, preserving knowledge, standing up for those without voices. Sanctuary work, all of it. Harry looked at his friends, saw his own wonder and uncertainty reflected in their faces. They'd come here for a simple evening of ghost stories and butterbeer. Instead, they'd stumbled into something much larger, an ancient magical practice, a responsibility, a calling. What happens if we say yes? Hermione asked practically. What changes? Nothing and everything, the elderly witch replied cryptically. You'll still live your lives, make your choices, follow your paths. but you'll do so with awareness of how your actions strengthen or weaken sanctuary, with intention behind your choices to protect and include, with connection to a network of others doing the same work. And you'll be able to strengthen the magic more deliberately, Malcolm added. Learn the specific charms and techniques we use. Understand how to read the signs when sanctuary is weakening somewhere. Know how to respond when protection is needed. Think of it like the Order of the Phoenix, suggested the wizard with paint-stained fingers. But instead of fighting dark wizards, you're maintaining spaces of light. Instead of seeking out battles, you're preventing them by ensuring people have places to belong. It's quieter work, slower work, but no less important. Harry thought about Dumbledore, about the Order, about all the ways his life had been shaped by people choosing to protect others. This felt different from that. Less dramatic, perhaps, but in some ways more fundamental. The Order had fought against darkness. This was about creating and maintaining light. We need time to think, he said slowly, to really understand what we'd be agreeing to. Of course, Madame Rosmerta said immediately. This isn't a decision to be made lightly or quickly. The magic has waited centuries. It can wait a bit longer while you consider. But understand this, the elderly witch said, her voice serious. Whether you formally accept or not, you're already part of this work. You can't unknow what you've learned tonight. You can't unfeel the magic you've been sensing all evening. The only choice is whether you do this work consciously or unconsciously, with training or without it, connected to others or alone. Harry felt the truth of that settle into his bones. She was right. He'd always felt drawn to protect others, to create spaces where people could be safe. Learning that this was part of a larger magical tradition, that others had been doing this work for centuries, that there were techniques and knowledge he could learn. That didn't change who he was. It just gave him new tools for work he was already doing. Can we ask questions? Hermione said, in a voice that suggested she had about 1,000 questions and was barely restraining herself from listing them all. Laughter rippled through the circle of elders, warm and accepting. As many as you like, Malcolm assured her, though perhaps not all tonight. The hour grows late, and some questions are better answered through experience than explanation. But I'll give you one piece of knowledge freely, the elderly witch said. Something to contemplate as you consider your choice. The magic of sanctuary is sustained through 3 things: intention, action, and story. You must intend to create refuge. You must act on that intention through daily choices, and you must tell the stories that teach others what sanctuary means and why it matters. That's why tonight happened the way it did, Harry realized. Every story we heard was teaching us, showing us different aspects of sanctuary magic. Exactly so, the witch confirmed, pleased. And your own stories, about the burrow, about the castle fighting, about Snape's complicated protection, those taught us as well. Showed us that you already understand the complexity and importance of this work. That's why we knew you were ready to hear the truth. Ron cleared his throat. So, if we agree to this, we're not joining some secret society or taking unbreakable vows or anything mental like that. Nothing so formal, Madame Rosmerta assured him with a smile. Just a commitment to conscious sanctuary work, to learning what we can teach you, to connecting with other keepers when protection is needed. to passing this knowledge on when the time comes, and to gathering here every Halloween, added the lavender-haired witch, to tell stories, to teach, to renew the magic through shared intention. That part is important, the annual renewal, the community reinforcement. We can agree to that, Harry said, surprising himself. Ron and Hermione looked at him sharply, but he met their eyes steadily. Not to everything, not yet, but to coming back every Halloween, to learning more, to thinking about what we've heard tonight. That's enough, Malcolm said with satisfaction. That's how it begins, with curiosity, with willingness to learn, with showing up. The rest follows naturally. The circle of elders relaxed, and Harry sensed that some test had been passed, some important threshold crossed. The pub's energy shifted again, becoming less ceremonial, more celebratory. Madame Rosmerta returned to her endless pitcher, refilling mugs with renewed vigor. "There's one more thing," the elderly witch said, beckoning Harry closer. When he approached, she pressed something into his hand, a small stone, warm from being held, with runes carved into its surface that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. "A sanctuary stone," she explained. "Key to Hogsmeade and Hogwarts both. If you're ever in need of refuge, or if you know someone who is, this will guide them here. Will ensure the doors open, the protections hold, the welcome is genuine. Keep it safe. Use it wisely." Harry closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its warmth seep into his palm. It felt alive somehow, aware, full of purpose. "Thank you," he said, inadequate words for the magnitude of what he'd been given. Similar stones were pressed into Ron's and Hermione's hands, each one unique, but clearly part of a set. They stood there, the three of them, holding pieces of magic older than memory, connected now to something larger than themselves. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks that formed, just for a moment, into the shape of a lighthouse, tall and steady, light shining out into darkness. Then the image scattered, and there was only flame. But the message remained, clear as words. You are the light. You are the beacon. You are sanctuary. And standing there in the Three Broomsticks on Halloween night, surrounded by people who had dedicated their lives to protecting and welcoming others, Harry Potter felt something settle into place in his chest. Not a burden, but a purpose. Not a weight, but wings. He had found his calling, and it had been waiting for him all along. The sanctuary stones sat on the table between them, like promises made solid, catching the firelight and throwing it back in complex patterns. Harry couldn't stop touching his, running his thumb over the carved runes that seemed to pulse with warmth beneath his fingers. Beside him, Hermione had already pulled out a small notebook, produced from somewhere in her beaded bag, and was sketching the runes, trying to capture their shifting nature on paper. "They won't stay still long enough to draw properly," she muttered, frustration edging into fascination. "The symbols keep rearranging themselves. I've never seen runework that's this fluid." "That's because they're not fixed spells," said Malcolm, settling back into his chair with the satisfied air of someone who had completed an important task. "Sanctuary stones respond to need. The runes shift to provide whatever protection is most necessary in the moment. Try to copy them exactly, and you'll drive yourself mad, Miss Granger. Better to understand their purpose than their precise form." Hermione looked torn between scholarly disappointment and intellectual intrigue. "But how do they know what protection is needed?" What's the mechanism of awareness? Intention, the elderly witch said simply. She had remained standing near the fire, her small frame casting a surprisingly long shadow. The same intention that Hengist wove into Hogsmeade's foundations, that the Hogwarts founders built into the castle. These stones are connected to that larger network of protective magic. They feel when someone needs sanctuary the way you might feel hunger or cold, as a fundamental, undeniable truth. Ron was turning his stone over and over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. So, if someone was in danger and I gave them this, it would lead them here, even if they'd never been to Hogsmeade before? It would lead them to the nearest sanctuary, corrected Madame Rosmerta, which might be Hogsmeade, or Hogwarts, or the Burrow, or any other place where sanctuary magic has been deliberately established. The stones don't have a single destination. They have a purpose. They find safety. Harry thought about that, about magic that prioritized purpose over destination. It reminded him of his Patronus, which took the form of his father's animagus shape. Not because he'd chosen it, but because that form meant protection to him at the deepest level. Magic responding to need rather than instruction. How many of these stones exist? Hermione asked, finally giving up on drawing and focusing entirely on the conversation. Fewer than there should be, Malcolm said with a touch of sadness. Creating them requires not just skill, but consensus. Multiple sanctuary keepers working together, pouring their combined intention into the stone. It's not magic one person can do alone. There are perhaps 30 stones in existence now, where once there were hundreds. What happened to them? Harry asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Wars, the lavender-haired witch said quietly. Both wars with Grindelwald and Voldemort. Sanctuary keepers died, taking their knowledge with them. Stones were lost or destroyed. The network weakened. And in the aftermath, when everyone was focused on rebuilding the obvious damage, homes and businesses and political structures, few remembered to rebuild the subtler magics, the ones that prevented conflicts rather than ending them. The weight of that settled over their table. Harry thought about all the things that had been lost in the wars, not just people, but knowledge, traditions, the quiet magics that had kept communities strong. He thought about Dumbledore, who had known about sanctuary magic. Malcolm's story had made that clear, and wondered what other knowledge had died with him. That's why you're teaching us, Hermione said slowly. It's not just about maintaining Hogsmeade specifically. It's about rebuilding the entire network of sanctuary magic that was damaged by the wars. Clever girl, the elderly witch said approvingly. Yes, exactly that. Hogsmeade and Hogwarts are strong, their foundations deep enough to have survived even the worst of the fighting. But there are other places, villages, homes, gathering spaces, that once held sanctuary magic and have lost it, or places that never had it but desperately need it. The work ahead isn't just maintenance, it's restoration and creation both. Ron looked slightly overwhelmed. That sounds like a lot more than just showing up on Halloween for stories. It is, Malcolm agreed, and no one expects you to do it all, or to do it immediately. Sanctuary work is the labor of lifetimes, of generations. We're asking you to join the effort, to learn and contribute what you can, not to solve everything yourselves. That's why it's a network, why we teach and work together. But you three have advantages the rest of us don't, added the wizard, with paint-stained fingers You're young, which means you'll be maintaining this magic long after we're gone. You survived both wars, which gives you credibility with both older and younger generations. And you're famous. Don't look so uncomfortable, Mr. Potter. It's simply true. Which means people listen when you speak. If you chose to teach others about sanctuary magic, to publicly value and practice it, that would strengthen the entire network more than decades of quiet work by us unknown folks. Harry shifted uncomfortably. He'd spent years trying to escape fame, trying to be just Harry, rather than the boy who lived. The idea of using that fame deliberately, even for something as important as this, felt manipulative somehow. I know that look, Madame Rosmerta said gently, refilling his mug without asking. You're thinking it would be using people, trading on a reputation you never wanted. But consider this. Your fame exists whether you want it or not. The question is whether you let it exist purposelessly, or whether you channel it towards something meaningful. Sanctuary work doesn't require you to perform or pretend, just to live openly in a way that demonstrates the values, to let people see that Harry Potter thinks protection and welcome matter more than power or glory. You already do that, Ron pointed out. Remember last month when those reporters wanted to interview you about your aura training, and instead you talked about the importance of community watch programs, about neighbors looking out for each other instead of relying on official law enforcement for everything. Harry had forgotten about that interview, had given it without thinking much about his answers. But Ron was right. He had talked about community protection, about how the most effective safety came from people caring about and watching out for their neighbors. He'd been drawing on lessons learned from the Order, from the way Molly Weasley had created sanctuary at the Burrow, from the way Hogwarts portraits and ghosts looked after students. He'd been doing sanctuary work without knowing to call it that. See, the elderly witch said, as if reading his thoughts, you're already a sanctuary keeper, Mr. Potter. We're just giving you the language and the community to do it more effectively. Hermione had that expression she got when connecting disparate pieces of information into a larger theory. This is why Dumbledore was so insistent that Harry stay with the Dursleys, isn't it? Not just because of the blood protection, but because the lack of sanctuary in that house, the explicit rejection of welcome and belonging, made Harry understand how desperately important those things are. He learned sanctuary's value by experiencing its absence. The circle of elders exchanged glances, something passing between them that Harry couldn't quite read. That's one interpretation, Malcolm said carefully. Though I'd argue Dumbledore's reasoning was more complex than that. He understood sanctuary magic, yes, but he also understood sacrifice and love and the kinds of protection that could only be invoked through blood. What he did was weave multiple forms of protection together, conventional wards, sacrificial magic, and yes, perhaps even the inadvertent lesson about sanctuary's importance. Whether that justifies the suffering he allowed you to endure. Malcolm shook his head. That's a question I'm not wise enough to answer. Harry appreciated the honesty, the refusal to either condemn or excuse Dumbledore entirely. It matched his own complicated feelings about the man who had shaped so much of his life while keeping so many secrets. But here's what I will say, Malcolm continued. Dumbledore was a sanctuary keeper too, in his way. He kept Hogwarts safe for decades. He created the Order of the Phoenix as a sanctuary for those fighting darkness. He taught, protected, welcomed the unwanted. He also made terrible mistakes, chose the greater good over individual comfort, manipulated people like pieces on a chessboard. Both things are true, and perhaps that's the most important lesson for you young people, that sanctuary keeping doesn't make you perfect or infallible. It's not about being a saint. It's about choosing, again and again, to create spaces of refuge even when you're flawed and uncertain yourself. The work is bigger than any one person, the lavender-haired witch added. That's why it's a network, why we teach and pass it on. No single keeper can maintain all the sanctuary that's needed. We each do what we can, where we are, with what we have, and trust that others are doing the same in their own places. Ron nodded slowly, like the clock at home, each hand tracking a different family member, but all of them connected to the same central magic. We're all part of the same timepiece, just pointing in different directions. That's a lovely metaphor, Mr. Weasley, the elderly witch said warmly, and quite accurate. Each sanctuary keeper is like a hand on that clock, moving independently but part of a larger mechanism that tracks safety and belonging for an entire community. The pub's energy had shifted again, becoming more intimate now. The earlier ceremonial weight had lifted, replaced by something that felt like mentorship, like the passing on of craft knowledge from master to apprentice. Other patrons had resumed their own conversations, giving the group near the fire a bubble of semi-privacy. "I have a question," Harry said. "About Snape." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "You said sanctuary magic is about creating spaces of welcome and belonging. But Snape was cruel. He made students feel unwelcome, excluded, afraid. How does that fit with him being a protector? Can someone create sanctuary while actively making others feel unsafe? It was a question that had been bothering Harry since he'd told the story of the Silver Doe, since Malcolm had spoken about complexity and contradiction. He needed to understand how someone could be both sanctuary keeper and source of harm. The elderly witch sighed, settling herself into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones ached. That's the hard question, isn't it? The one we all wrestle with. And the answer is, it depends. "That's not very helpful," Ron muttered. "But it's true," she insisted. "Sanctuary magic requires intention toward protection and welcome, but it doesn't require perfection in executing that intention. Snape protected you, Mr. Potter, but he did so cruelly. He maintained Dumbledore's sanctuary at Hogwarts during the war, but he terrorized students to do it. Was that sanctuary work? Yes and no. He was doing sanctuary work in service of the larger cause," Malcolm elaborated. "Keeping you alive so you could ultimately defeat Voldemort, maintaining his cover as a Death Eater so he could undermine them from within. But he wasn't doing sanctuary work in his daily interactions with students. There, he was actively harmful. The two things existed simultaneously, protection on one level, harm on another. So he was a sanctuary keeper who failed at sanctuary," Hermione said. "Or he was a protector who understood tactics but not care," suggested the lavender-haired witch. "Or he was a man so damaged by his own lack of sanctuary growing up that he could only protect others through cruelty, because that's what protection had always looked like to him." "People are complicated, Miss Granger. Sanctuary work doesn't change that." Harry thought about Snape's childhood, about the glimpses he'd seen in those memories. The thin, pale boy in the poor clothing, watching Lily from the shadows. Snape had never had sanctuary himself. His home had been violent, his school years marked by bullying, his adult life consumed by spying and fear. How could he teach others about belonging when he'd never truly belonged anywhere himself? That's why community matters, Madame Rosmerta said quietly. Why this work can't be done alone. Snape tried to be a solitary protector, working in isolation, trusting no one. And yes, he kept you alive, Mr. Potter. But at what cost? To himself, to the students he traumatized, to the sanctuary he could have created but didn't. If he'd been connected to other keepers, if he'd had support and guidance, if he'd learned to protect without harming, perhaps things would have been different. But we can't know that, Malcolm added. And we honor his sacrifice while acknowledging his failures. That's part of sanctuary work too, holding complexity, refusing to reduce people to heroes or villains, seeing the whole truth and choosing compassion anyway. The fire crackled, and Harry watched the flames dance, thinking about Snape's grey eyes watching him, always watching, even in death, protecting even while hating. It was perhaps the saddest form of sanctuary Harry could imagine. Refuge offered without love, safety provided without welcome. It had kept Harry alive, but it had also wounded something in both of them. I don't want to be like that, Harry said quietly. I don't want to protect people while making them feel small. I want to do this right. Then you will, the elderly witch said simply, because you've already identified what matters. Care alongside protection, welcome alongside safety. That awareness is half the work. The other half is practice, community, and forgiveness when you inevitably fall short sometimes. We all make mistakes, Ron said, with feeling. Remember third year when I was horrible to Hermione about her cat? I thought I was protecting Scabbers, but I was actually defending a Death Eater and hurting my best friend. Did that make me a terrible person, or just a confused teenager who got it wrong? Both, Hermione said, but she smiled as she said it. You were genuinely terrible during that fight, and you were also trying to protect something you loved. You learned from it. That's what matters. Exactly, Malcolm said. Sanctuary work isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them, making amends when possible, and choosing better next time. Snape never learned. He protected but never grew. You three have already demonstrated more growth and self-awareness than many adults twice your age. That's why we're confident in teaching you. The conversation drifted then, moving from heavy philosophy to more practical questions. Hermione wanted to know about the specific charms used to maintain wards. Ron asked about the logistics of the Halloween gatherings, how people knew to attend. Harry found himself asking about the other sanctuary keepers, whether there were networks beyond Hogsmeade, how they coordinated during crises. The answers were detailed, practical, grounding. There was ward work to learn, but also simpler things. How to recognize when someone needed help, how to offer it without being intrusive, how to create spaces that felt welcoming, through small choices about lighting and seating and warmth. There were formal gatherings like tonight's, but also informal check-ins. A network of communication through patronuses and enchanted coins. A system for calling for help when protection was urgently needed. It was overwhelming and comforting at once. Overwhelming in its scope, comforting in its structure. This wasn't just an abstract magical philosophy. It was a practical craft with techniques to learn and community to rely on. You don't have to master everything immediately, Madame Rosmerta assured them, reading their expressions accurately. Start with one thing, one practice, one technique, one conscious choice to create sanctuary in your daily life. Build from there. What should we start with? Harry asked. The elderly witch smiled, her ancient face crinkling with warmth. That's for each of you to discover. What calls to you? What feels urgent or important or simply right? Trust that instinct. The magic will guide you toward the work you're meant to do. Harry touched the sanctuary stone again, feeling its warmth pulse against his palm. He thought about the Burrow's kitchen, about Hogwarts' common rooms, about the Three Broomsticks with its endless butterbeer and welcoming fire. He thought about what these places had in common. Not just protection, but welcome. Not just safety, but belonging. He knew what he wanted to start with. He wanted to learn how to create that feeling deliberately, how to pour intention into spaces until they became refuges. He wanted to build sanctuaries the way his mother's love had built protection, through choice and sacrifice, an absolute commitment to others' safety. He wanted to ensure that no one else had to grow up in a cupboard under the stairs, feeling unwanted and alone. That was where he would begin. The first hints of dawn were touching the eastern windows when the gathering finally began to disperse. Harry hadn't noticed the hours passing. Time had moved strangely in the Three Broomsticks tonight, stretching and compressing like something alive and responsive. Outside, the sky was shifting from deep velvet to slate grey, stars fading one by one as All Saints' Day claimed the morning. But the fire still burned with that same steady warmth it had maintained all evening, never needing fuel, never diminishing. Harry found himself staring at it, understanding now that it was more than ordinary flame. It was intention made visible, welcome made warm, sanctuary expressed in light and heat. The fire will burn until the last person leaves, Madame Rosmerta said softly, appearing beside him with the uncanny timing she'd demonstrated all night. That's part of the magic of this place. On Halloween, when the veil thins and the stories flow, the Three Broomsticks holds its welcome for as long as anyone needs it. Some years, that fire has burned for 2 days straight. Has anyone ever needed it that long? Ron asked, stifling a yawn. Once, Rosmerta said, her expression distant with memory. During the First War, a family fleeing Death Eaters came through that door at midnight on Halloween, terrified and wounded. They stayed for 36 hours, sheltering, healing, being held by the magic of this place until they were strong enough to run again. The fire burned the entire time, and everyone who came through those doors understood, without being told, that they needed to be quiet, to respect the sanctuary, to help if they could, and stay out of the way if they couldn't. Harry could picture it. Frightened people, huddled near this same hearth while war raged outside, protected by intention and community, and magic so old it predated memory. He wondered if his parents had known about sanctuary magic, if they'd been part of this network of keepers. The thought that they might have been, that he might be continuing work they'd started, made something in his chest ache with bittersweet longing. Your mother knew, the elderly witch said, as if reading his thoughts. She'd been preparing to leave, wrapping herself in a thick cloak against the November cold. But she paused to look at Harry directly. Lily Evans Potter. She understood sanctuary magic in her bones, though I don't know if she ever formalized that understanding. The protection she gave you, that wasn't just her love, though that was the foundation. It was sanctuary magic, woven through sacrifice. She made you a sanctuary unto yourself, a walking refuge that darkness couldn't fully touch. Harry's breath caught. He'd never thought of it that way, that his mother's protection was a form of sanctuary magic, that he'd been carrying this tradition with him literally since birth. She would be proud, the witch continued, her voice gentle. Proud that you're choosing to learn this work consciously. Proud that you survived your lack of sanctuary with the Dursleys and still chose to create it for others. Proud that you're standing here now, ready to carry this forward. She reached up. Harry had to bend down slightly for her to manage it, and touched his forehead where the scar lay hidden beneath his hair. You bear the mark of failed sanctuary, Mr. Potter, but you also bear the mark of perfect sanctuary. Both shaped you, both made you who you are. She withdrew her hand, nodded to Malcolm and the other elders, and made her way to the door. Other patrons were leaving now too, trickling out in ones and twos, calling goodbyes and promises to return next year. Each person who left touched the door frame on their way out. Harry noticed it suddenly, that brief contact of palm to wood, a recognition of threshold, of boundary, of the magic that made this place sanctuary. You should do that too when you leave, Malcolm said. Touch the threshold with intention. Acknowledge what this place is, what it offers. It strengthens the magic. Every recognition, every moment of conscious gratitude adds to the protective layers. Like feeding the fire, Hermione said thoughtfully. Not with wood, but with awareness and appreciation. Precisely, Miss Granger. Magic responds to attention. The more people consciously recognize sanctuary, the stronger sanctuary becomes. The lavender-haired witch was gathering her things, carefully wrapping a package that clinked like bottles. Before you go, she said to the trio, I want to give you something. A practical tool for your sanctuary work. She handed each of them a small vial filled with liquid that glowed faintly silver in the firelight. Essence of welcome, she explained. A few drops on a threshold, in a hearth, around a doorway, anywhere you want to strengthen sanctuary magic. It won't create protection where there's no foundation, but it will amplify existing intentions toward welcome and safety. Use it sparingly. It takes months to brew, and the ingredients are particular. What's in it? Hermione asked, examining her vial with scientific interest. Moonlight collected on midsummer, tears of joy. Actual tears, mind you, freely given by someone experiencing genuine happiness. Morning dew from a place where something good began, and a few other things I'm not at liberty to share. The recipe is passed down through sanctuary keepers, taught when the teacher judges the student ready. And you're ready, Madame Rosmerta added, or you will be. Consider this an investment in your future work. Harry tucked his vial carefully into his pocket next to the sanctuary stone. He was accumulating tools, knowledge, responsibility. It should have felt heavy, but instead it felt right. Like pieces of himself he hadn't known were missing, were finally clicking into place. The wizard, with paint-stained fingers, approached, carrying 3 books that looked ancient and well-used. Reference materials, he said gruffly, distributing them. Basic ward theory, threshold magic, and the history of sanctuary traditions in magical Britain. Not light reading, but necessary if you're serious about learning this craft properly. Hermione clutched her book like it was precious treasure, which to her it probably was. Ron accepted his with good grace, though Harry suspected it would end up on a shelf, while Ron learned through doing rather than reading. Harry opened his to the first page and found an inscription in faded ink. For those who would make home for the homeless, refuge for the frightened, sanctuary for all who need it. May your hearths burn bright and your doors stand open. Who wrote this? He asked, but the wizard just smiled mysteriously and moved away. One by one, the elders departed, each leaving some small gift or word of wisdom. A compass that pointed toward the nearest sanctuary. A candle that would burn without consuming itself, perfect for vigils or long watches. A small mirror that would show not your reflection, but the emotional state of anyone who looked into it, useful for recognizing when someone needed help, even if they couldn't ask. Malcolm was the last to go, aside from Madame Rosmerta, who was staying to close up the pub, or whatever passed for closing up on the Halloween morning when the fire still burned. He stood in the doorway, framed by the growing daylight behind him, and regarded the trio with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and solemnity. "You did well tonight," he said simply. "Asked good questions, told true stories, showed yourselves capable of holding complexity and choosing compassion. That's all sanctuary work really is, holding the messy, complicated truth of things and choosing to care anyway, choosing to create safety even when the world is dangerous, choosing to welcome even when you're tired and scared yourself." "Thank you for teaching us," Harry said, meaning it profoundly. "Thank you for being teachable," Malcolm countered. "Not everyone is, you know. Some people hear about sanctuary magic and dismiss it as soft or naive. They think protection has to be hard, that safety requires walls and weapons and keeping people out. They don't understand that the strongest fortresses are the ones where people choose to stay, where they fight to defend, not because they're trapped, but because they're home." He touched the door frame. That same gesture Harry had watched dozens of people make tonight. "Next Halloween, you'll be back. Not as students, but as teachers, sharing what you've learned this year with whoever needs to hear it. That's how the cycle continues, learning and teaching, receiving and giving. The magic flows through us and forward. We're just stewards, not owners." Then he was gone, stepping out into the grey morning and pulling the door shut behind him. The fire dimmed slightly, acknowledging his departure, but continued burning steadily. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat in the now quiet pub, surrounded by the gifts they'd been given, the knowledge they'd received, the responsibility they'd accepted. Madame Rosmerta was behind the bar, quietly cleaning glasses, giving them space to process everything. That was Ron started, then trailed off. I don't even know what that was. The most important night of my life. The weirdest? Both. Both, Hermione agreed. Definitely both. I have so many questions, so much to research and understand, and she caught herself, laughed softly. But that can wait. Right now, I just want to sit here and feel what this feels like, being part of something this old and important. Harry knew what she meant. There was a quality to the air in the Three Broomsticks now, in the aftermath of the evening's revelations, that he wanted to memorize. A feeling of potential, of doors opening, of paths appearing that he hadn't known existed. He'd spent so much of his life reacting to threats, to expectations, to the burden of prophecy and fame. This felt different. This felt like choosing rather than being chosen. "Do you think we can actually do this?" he asked quietly. "Build sanctuaries, maintain magic, help rebuild what the wars destroyed. I think we're already doing it," Ron said. "We just didn't know to call it that. And now we've got help. People to teach us, tools to use, a whole network of others doing the same work. We're not alone in this." "We're never alone," Hermione added, her hand finding Harry's on the table. "That's what tonight taught me more than anything else. There's always been this network, this community of people choosing to create safety and welcome. We just couldn't see it before. Now we can. Now we're part of it." Madame Rosmerta approached with one final round of butterbeer. "On the house," she insisted. "Before you go back to the castle, I want to tell you one last story. A short one, I promise. About the very first Halloween gathering in this pub." They settled in to listen, cradling their warm mugs. "It was nearly a century ago," Rosmerta began. "The publican before my predecessor, a wizard named Aldrich, who was ancient even then, decided that Halloween should be more than just costumes and sweets. He'd lived through Grindelwald's rise, had seen how communities fractured under fear, how people stopped trusting their neighbors, stopped helping strangers. He wanted to create a tradition that would counteract that would remind people every year why community matters." She gestured around the pub. "So he invited everyone in Hogsmeade to come on Halloween night and share stories. Not scary stories. There were enough real terrors in the world. Stories about protection, about kindness, about times when people had helped each other or been helped themselves. And he wove a spell into the invitation, subtle and strong. Anyone who came and told a true story would contribute to the protective magic around Hogsmeade. Their words would literally strengthen the sanctuary." "That's brilliant," Hermione breathed. "Using storytelling as a mechanism for collective magic. The intention of the gathered community creating protection for that same community." "Exactly. And it worked. Hogsmeade survived Grindelwald's war largely intact, not because we had the strongest wards or the most powerful defenders, but because we had this tradition, this annual renewal, this collective commitment to sanctuary. Every year, the magic grew stronger. Every year, more people understood what they were part of and chose to maintain it." Rosmerta's expression grew thoughtful. "Then came Voldemort's first rise, and the gatherings continued. Some years, they were smaller, people too frightened to leave their homes, even for this. Some years, they were desperate, people clinging to this tradition like a lifeline, needing to believe that sanctuary still existed somewhere. But the gatherings never stopped. Even in the darkest years, at least a handful of people showed up on Halloween to tend the fire and tell the stories." "And during the Second War?" Harry asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "During the Second War, when Voldemort's forces occupied Hogsmeade, the gathering happened in secret, in basements, in hidden rooms, in the Shrieking Shack itself. Anywhere people could safely gather and reinforce the magic. Dumbledore helped with that, created portkeys that would bring people to safe locations, set up wards that would hide the gatherings. He understood how important this tradition was, even if he never spoke of it publicly." Harry felt a rush of gratitude toward Dumbledore, complicated as his feelings about the man remained. He'd been protecting this tradition, this magic, even while fighting the war in more obvious ways. He'd understood that Sanctuary needed defending just as much as any fortress. "And now," Rosmerta said, her voice warming, "you three are part of this tradition, part of this unbroken chain of people choosing to create and maintain Sanctuary. Your stories tonight about the burrow, about the castle fighting, about Snape's complicated protection, they're woven into the magic now. They'll be told in future years, teaching future Sanctuary keepers what protection can look like." The weight of that settled over Harry like a cloak, not burdensome, but sheltering. His story, their stories, would continue beyond them, would teach others, would strengthen Sanctuary for people he'd never meet, in times he'd never see. "We should go," Hermione said reluctantly, glancing at the windows where daylight was growing stronger. "Breakfast will be starting soon at the castle. People will wonder where we are." They stood, gathering their gifts, books and vials and mirrors and the precious Sanctuary stones. Harry led the way to the door, then paused at the threshold, remembering Malcolm's instruction. He placed his palm flat against the doorframe, feeling the warm wood beneath his skin, and thought, "Thank you for shelter, for teaching, for welcome, for showing me work worth doing." The wood seemed to pulse beneath his hand, acknowledging the intention. Ron and Hermione did the same, each touching the threshold with their own private gratitude. Then they stepped out into the November morning. The village was quiet, most of Hogsmeade still sleeping after the long Halloween night. But smoke rose from a few chimneys, and the lights glowed in a handful of windows. The world continuing, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Harry could feel it now, the protective magic woven through this place, subtle as breath, but just as essential. It was in the way the streets curved, creating natural gathering spaces, in the way the buildings stood close enough to be neighborly, but far enough apart for privacy, in 100 tiny choices about how to build and maintain a place where people could feel safe. They walked slowly up the path toward Hogwarts, none of them eager to rush. The castle rose against the dawn sky, its towers and turrets catching the first rays of sun. Harry had walked this path hundreds of times, but today it felt different. He was seeing it with new eyes, understanding eyes. He could sense the connection between village and castle, two sanctuaries supporting each other, strengthening each other, part of the same ancient network of protection. "Look," Ron said softly, pointing. In the grass beside the path, autumn crocuses were blooming, pale purple flowers that shouldn't have been growing this late in the year. But as Harry watched, more appeared, unfurling in a line that led toward the castle gates like a welcoming pathway. "The magic acknowledging us," Hermione whispered, "recognizing that we're part of the network now. Sanctuary welcoming Sanctuary keepers home." Harry felt tears prick his eyes, not sad tears but overwhelmed ones, grateful ones. He'd spent so much of his life feeling like he didn't quite belong anywhere, like he was always slightly outside looking in. At the Dursleys, obviously, but even at Hogwarts sometimes, even surrounded by friends. There had always been a part of him that felt temporary, provisional, like his place could be revoked at any moment. But this felt permanent, fundamental. He wasn't just a student at Hogwarts or a visitor to Hogsmeade. He was a sanctuary keeper, connected to this place at a level deeper than residence or attendance. He belonged here in a way that couldn't be revoked or destroyed. The magic itself had claimed him. They reached the castle gates, just as the sun cleared the mountains, flooding the grounds with golden light. The gates swung open before they could touch them, the castle welcoming them home, acknowledging their return. As they crossed the threshold onto Hogwarts grounds, Harry felt it, the same pulse of recognition he'd felt when touching the Three Broomsticks door frame. The castle knew what they'd learned, what they'd become, what they'd committed to, and it was responding, welcoming, supporting. "We should sleep," Ron said, practically, though he was smiling. "We've been up all night. I'm fairly certain we've got classes tomorrow. Today, whatever. Sleep sounds perfect," Hermione agreed. "And then we can start reading, planning, figuring out where to begin." "Tomorrow," Harry said firmly. "Today we sleep. Tomorrow, we start the work. We have time." Because that was the other thing he'd learned tonight. Sanctuary work wasn't urgent in the way fighting Voldemort had been urgent. It was important, essential, but it was also patient. It had waited centuries. It could wait one more day while they rested. They climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower, exhaustion finally catching up with them, now that the magic and adrenaline of the evening had faded. The corridors were empty, everyone else still sleeping or just beginning to wake. The fat lady's portrait was dozing in her frame, but she woke as they approached. "Out all night on Halloween, were you?" she said with knowing disapproval. "Up to mischief, I suppose." "Not mischief," Harry said, too tired to come up with a clever response. "Something else. Something good." The fat lady studied them for a long moment. Then her expression softened. "I can see that. There's something different about you three this morning. Something settled. Like you found something you were looking for." "Maybe we have," Hermione said softly. The portrait swung open without requiring the password. Another small acknowledgement, another recognition. They climbed through into the common room, where the fire burned low but steady, waiting to welcome them home. Harry paused, looking at that fire. So like the one in the Three Broomsticks, so like fires burning in hearths across the magical world. All connected, all part of the same network of warmth and welcome, all tended by a people who chose every day to create sanctuary. Ron was already headed for the stairs to the dormitory, yawning hugely. Hermione lingered a moment longer, standing beside Harry. "We can do this," she said quietly. "This work, this responsibility. We can help rebuild what was lost and create new sanctuaries where they're needed. Together, together," Harry agreed. "Always together." They stood there a moment longer, two friends exhausted and hopeful and changed, watching the fire burn. Then they climbed the stairs to their separate dormitories, to sleep and dream of doors standing open, of hearths burning bright, of a world where everyone had a place to call home. Outside, All Saints' Day claimed the morning fully. Halloween was over for another year, but its magic remained woven into stones and stories, carried forward by those who chose to tend it. The sanctuary keepers, old and new, resting now but ready to continue the work when they woke, the work of welcome, the work of protection, the work of the home. And in the Gryffindor common room, the fire burned on steady and warm, keeping watch over those who slept within its light, keeping them safe, keeping them home, just as it always had, just as it always would.